Text Talks.
Hello,
I'm Alex,
and I'm Katie.
and this is Text Talks. So, Katie, what are we talking about today?
Today we're going to look at gender in contemporary Hinduism. So we have done another podcast and a whole set of resources for gender in Hinduism through goddesses, and specifically looking at texts and how goddesses appear in texts and their stories. I've also looked at gender in the Ramayana, so lots of work on texts. So now we're going to bring it right up into the contemporary world and really think about how Hinduism deals with gender and, incorporates gender today in India. So the reason why I've studied or looked at gender so much in these podcasts is because it's all over the syllabuses, all over all of them. So we've got phrases like the role and status of women, sexual equality, and then even the more specific ideas such as sati and widows. So we're going to look at all of these today, and specifically look at three examples of how women are put into the public sphere or the public eye, how they're really not hidden away in any way. They're given control of their own space through politics, or in lots of different ways. So that's what we're going to do today.
Sounds great. Where do we start?
We're going to start with a festival called Durga Puja. So this is one of the most famous festivals in Hinduism and in the Hindu calendar. It's a 10-day festival that falls around September, October, and is there to worship the goddess Durga. So again, make sure you have a look at the resources for my for the
Goddesses podcast.
Yeah, and the PowerPoints and worksheets, because I talk a lot about Durga there. But just a quick recap: Durga is one of the fiercest deities in the Hindu pantheon. She's a warrior. She has weapons. She rides a lion. She's got lots of terrifying, different forms. Often in text she's depicted just absolutely annihilating in battle and killing demons and generally triumphing over evil. So that's who this festival celebrates. It's particularly popular in northeast India, and it's also celebrated in Nepal and Bangladesh. And the festival, like a lot of Hindu festivals, it includes parades, performances, gifting presents to friends and family, seeing your family, lots of food, and reciting scripture that's relevant to Durga's various battles and triumphs. It's believed to mostly mark the victory of Durga over an evil demon, but other deities are celebrated as part of the festival. So Lakshmi, Sarasvati, Ganesha are all celebrated, and different stories are told. It's 10 days, so a lot goes on over the time, but it's a really important festival for the Shakta tradition and celebrating the goddess tradition more generally. And I think that this is just a great example to have under your belt, because as one of the most famous Hindu festivals, it's really interesting that it's about a goddess and it's about a woman. So it's just a great example of how women are really put in the public eye and absolutely celebrated, and not just celebrated for being a woman. Durga is just terrifying and strong and powerful, so it's definitely a great example to use in your exams when you're looking about gender representation, the roles of women, because Durga definitely challenges some traditional ideas of domestic roles of women. Another great and really interesting example for women in the public eye, and specifically in politics, is through looking at the different women's movements in India. And there have been quite a few, but I'm going to look at two in particular. And one is sticking with Durga for a while, is the Durga Vahini, so that means Durga's army. And what the Durga Vahini is a woman's wing of the Hindu nationalist group, the VHP, or Vishwa Hindu Parishad. And so the Durga Vahini are there for women to join and get involved with politics, but there's also a lot more to it than that. So there's a lot about empowering women, particularly women who have come from difficult situations. So widows, women who have been deserted by their husbands or have been victims of domestic abuse. It welcomes them and gives them training and skills to allow them to become more independent and to, perhaps have vocational training or tailoring centres to give them skills to provide for themselves. But it also looks at training them in terms of combat. So looking at how to wield knives and firearms. So give them more protection and empower them to be able to defend themselves physically if needed. And these skills are often given to women through training camps that tend to be about 20 days long, and they welcome women aged 15 to 35 years. And so it's a community that really defends women, empowers women, but it's also part of the political sphere. So it's part of the Hindu Nationalist Party, but specifically for women. So this is a woman's only space.
Mm-hmm.
Another group that's fairly similar, but we're going to momentarily take a little step back from Hinduism, because this is a secular group. But I just think they're too interesting an example to not talk about, but it does serve as a useful comparison to Durga Vahini, and that's the Gulabi gang. So you might also have heard them referred to as the Pink Sari gang. They're very recognisable because they all wear pink saris, and that actually reflects the fact that they're secular, because the reason they wear pink is because pink doesn't have any religious or political associations. So other colours do, such as orange. Pink is a neutral colour, so that's why, to us it might think, oh, pink is, a feminine colour, but it's not about that at all. It's a neutral colour, and that's why they wear pink saris. But this is a group that, very similar to the Durga Vahini, get together to empower women. They train in martial arts, so they specifically use sticks and will create opportunities for women to support themselves and support others, particularly those from backgrounds in domestic abuse or sexual violence. But they also, what's key to both Gulabi Gang and Durga Vahini, is that they are vigilante. So vigilante means that they take justice or the law into their own hands. So particularly they're looking at patriarchal structures that oppress or endanger women, and they, will go out and beat up someone if they think that they have been oppressing someone or, not treating their wife as they should. Well, then they will take the punishment into their own hands. And this is done through the, physical training, self-defense and combat.
And I imagine also the social pressure, knowing that someone is part of one of these communities, it's preventative as well. Knowing that these communities are active in an area, if they are vigilante, it's going to stop potentially those instances of domestic abuse happening before they even happen, because they see that it's what's happened to someone else maybe. Yeah,
hopefully just the strong presence has that effect, but also maybe creates a bit more awareness of how you should be treating your wife and the wrongs of domestic violence. Also a good time now is to recommend a couple of movies that will go into detail about these two movements. So Durga Vahini, watch the movie called The World Before Her, which is a documentary that I haven't actually watched, but Alex has, so he can tell you a bit more about them.
Yeah, so The World Before Her is a really interesting documentary because it follows two women in India, and I think it was filmed in 2011 or something, and one of these women is just joining the Durga Vahini, and then it's comparing this person with a Indian catwalk model. And it's about how feminine empowerment has two different sides, because obviously you've got these shots of the woman in the Durga Vahini doing martial arts, hitting people with sticks, etc. But then you've also got this concept of the new Indian woman brought out through this catwalk model, and discussing how both can be empowering and also the difficulties that both face in these certain institutions. So it's very good. It's a very good watch.
Yeah, I definitely should watch it. And the documentary, if you want to look at a bit more of the Gulabi Gang, is a documentary called The Gulabi Gang, and both of these films have won various awards, so definitely give them a look. Just to note, there is another film, a Hindi film called The Gulab Gang, that actually the founder has objected because they weren't asked permission, and that's actually a dramatisation of the Gulabi Gang story. So because the founder's not happy with that, just if you do come across that, watch it with caution and be aware that, you know, some things might not be accurate. But the only reason why I bring up the Gulabi Gang alongside Durga Vahini is more for just for you to think about, you know, how do they compare, what is similar, are there any differences, or can you note any differences between them? When you're looking at Durga Vahini, what's particularly Hindu about that? Of course, that's in the name of Hindu nationalism, so it's interesting to think about what is Hindu about that, or is there not a specific, you know, the female empowerment here is more general than that. It's just, I think, an interesting example to consider alongside each other.
You know, if you're a teacher listening to this in your classrooms, you could potentially set the homework of go and watch a film on the Gulabi Gang, go watch a film on the Pink Sari Gang.
It's always good when the homework is a film.
Yeah, and then you can have a debate either on an online platform or in class about these differences, and your PowerPoint, which goes alongside this podcast, also has that in there, doesn't it? It's got some of these questions.
And there are some discussion questions in there, and on the worksheet as well has an extract from a newspaper article about Durga Vahini, so definitely have a look at that for some activities or discussion questions. Okay, and the final example we're going to look at, I mentioned briefly before, is widowhood. Now, widowhood is a really interesting and obviously sad and somber topic to discuss, and what is often at the forefront of people's mind when we're talking about gender equality or gender in Hinduism, because when you say widowhood in India or in Hinduism, you think of sati. Now, sati is the practice of widow burning, which is when a woman's husband dies, she burns herself on the pyre, thus committing suicide, but, you know, joining her husband. It's also been known as sati, which is the British colonial term for it, so we tend to use the word sati instead because sati is a sort of what British colonial powers heard, you know, it's more of a phonetic pronunciation. But sati was made illegal in India a long time ago, in the 1800s, and it's been, you know, it's a very outdated historical practice with very, very few modern cases. However, there is still an impact in which there is a lot of taboo around widowhood today. But I talk about sati in this way because I just think it's one that it's definitely something worth talking about and worth thinking about, but I think often how it's used isn't in the right context. So it's very, very easy in an exam or in a debate, if you want to bring up an example of how women aren't treated well in Hinduism, you say, oh, well, sati, because that's clearly a horrible practice, it's terrible, it's horribly oppressive. But I think we just need to, when we do talk about it, be very careful to make sure that we contextualise it and say that it is not used or it's not standard practice today. No, like very, very few people would ever defend it in contemporary times. So if you are going to use it, just make sure you explain that this is, you know, a historical practice that's not relevant to today.
In the same way that hangings in Britain haven't been around for hundreds of years, but if you were looking at British culture and, you know, prioritised hangings, it's like, well, that's not what we have today. So
exactly. So it's absolutely fine to use this in your exams as an example. It's definitely an example there, but I think it's really important that you either counter argument with however this is outdated and it wasn't abolished, or that you are contextualising it. It's like, this is, you know, part of Hinduism's history, so talking about it in that way, just to make sure we're not making the argument that Hinduism doesn't treat women well because sati, because that's just not relevant and it's not appropriate to use that for the contemporary argument.
Mm-hmm.
So what we are going to do is look at a contemporary context specifically around widowhood to give us a really interesting example to use in exams which does actually apply to today. So just for some general knowledge about widows in India, they can be recognised often because they dress in white saris.
That's interesting, because obviously in the UK and parts of the West, white is associated with marriage, not with death.
Yeah, no, it is, but it's in India, white is the colour of mourning. Interestingly, the association with wedding dresses in particular in the West or the UK comes from Queen Victoria. So it's not that older tradition really, if you think about it. But I think it was very unfashionable to wear white at a wedding, but Queen Victoria wore white at her wedding, and it's been popular ever since then.
There you go, fun fact.
Just a fun fact, but not in India. India's known for the beautiful red and gold saris and weddings, but for white is the colour of mourning in India. But the big issues that widows face in India and in Hinduism is often financial insecurity, because they don't necessarily inherit their husband's wealth, which means that they often need to rely on their husband's family to support them. Although often, or too often, widows are rejected or neglected by the family, meaning that they're ostracised. And so one of the outcomes of this is that many Hindu widows have relocated to a particular city called Vrindavan, which is a holy city actually believed to be the birthplace of Krishna. And over 10,000 widows live there, but many of them live on the streets and live in poverty, are not supported at all. And there's a group called the Sulab International, and this is a group that do a lot of good work, but one of the things they do is protect and support the widows in this city. And here's a statement from the Sulab International's website. And they say, "For decades draped in white saris and secluded from the mainstream society, they survived destitution. Abandoned by their families, they were forced to live a life of oblivion and abjectness. Ever since the horrendous practice of widows throwing themselves on the pyres of their dead husbands, sati, was banned, Vrindavan became an abode for them. Living in acute poverty, these women were ostracised by societal stigmas, for their shadow too was considered a bad omen. The temple-crammed town of Krishna is also identified as the city of widows now." So this quote shows how, even though sati was banned a long time ago, there is still this lasting stigma around, taboo around widows, and also that because of this, widows are often neglected by their families and forced to live in poverty in the city of Vrindavan. But the Sulab International organisation work hard to give these women financial security by paying money and to them, but what's important is that they pay money directly to the widows. So often in charities what is the case is that they are given to the city to support people, or they're given to different middlemen, essentially. Sulab International are very clear that they want to make sure that the money goes directly to the widows, so nothing gets lost. There's no kind of charge or any corrupt issues in which money is lost elsewhere. All the money goes directly to the widows. But the most famous movement that the Sulab International did was getting the widows, or encouraging the widows, to take part in the Holi festival. So Holi is the Hindu festival of colours, and often recognisable by beautiful pictures of people celebrating by throwing coloured powder everywhere. And so Sulab International had 800 widows in 2013 celebrate Holi. So throughout the celebration, the widows would throw the coloured powder all over their white saris.
That's kind of symbolic then, right?
Yeah, because they're literally, white is the colour of being a widow essentially, but they're covering those white saris in these beautiful colours. And actually make sure you have a look at the accompanying PowerPoint to this, because I've included some photos from this, and I'll just get some up for Alex to look at, because they're really beautiful, and it's really heartwarming to see these women who, you can see that these white saris have been, you can't recognise that they're white anymore because they're just completely coloured, and they're very moving and they're full of joy, and you can see in the photos that they're dancing
and they're joining in with everyone else.
Exactly. It's really breaking down the barriers in the community where before they were ostracised and they were seen as bad omens, but now here they are in with everyone else, and almost they're covering the white saris. Is a very symbolic way of breaking down those barriers. And actually later that year, Sulab International did the same with Diwali, which is the Hindu festival of lights, and they had these widows celebrating Diwali out in the open, out in the public. So this is another example, as along with the others, of women put into the public sphere, but for widows it's really important because they for so long have been out of the public sphere, and in many ways that's a hangover from sati, even though, as I said, that was abolished a long time ago. This is a step towards breaking down those taboos and stigma against widowhood. So in summary, like any culture, Hinduism and India has a varied history when it comes to gender, and while in some ways there are the most empowering female figures, looking back at the goddesses, there are also some really sad parts of history, such as sati. But I just think it's really important that we look at the whole of the contemporary situation and the whole of the religion, and make sure that we do acknowledge the context of how and what we're talking about. Is it fair to use sati as an example in exam without also talking about Durga and Durga puja? And is it fair to maybe even talk about Hindu nationalism without talking about the women's movements within Hindu nationalism? I think these are just really important questions that as students of religious studies we have to keep asking ourselves, to make sure that as we are, building arguments and ideas about these religions, we're representing them properly, even though, it can be very easy to use the most extreme example in an exam just for the sake of the argument. It's really important that we do these religions justice and make sure we're talking in the right context.
Wow. Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you.
If you've got any questions about anything Katie said today, feel free to contact us either on Facebook at Text Talks or on Twitter at Text Talks 1. And we really look forward to hearing from you.
See you in the next podcast.